Welcome back to Beyond the Uniform. I'm Justin Asiri, and each week I interview military veterans about their civilian career. Today's episode number 93 with Matt Ufford.
My job now is so delightfully meaningless and inconsequential that the only way that I can look at sports and covering sports is that it's the silliest, most fun thing. It allows me to, after the seriousness, the ultimate seriousness of combat in the Marine Corps. But what it does is that perspective helps me to laugh at anything, no matter how seemingly serious it is.
Well, for those of you who have listened to the show before or who have listened to NFL Nate Boyer's interview, you know I know nothing about sports, so you have to take this with even a bigger grain of salt when I say I loved this interview with Matt. Matt is over at SB Nation. He is a writer and video producer all about sports, and although I have no personal interest in sports, I loved this interview. A couple reasons. So Matt, he followed this path of wanting to become a writer, and it's not a well-traveled path for veterans. And he talks about reps and how it's just all about practice. And he talks about being in Manhattan and being unemployed or underemployed for 2 years and just doing whatever it took to get those jobs and to get those starting positions, and taking those jobs that took nights and weekends to cover sporting events, and just how he worked his way up into what I think a lot of you will consider a dream job. He literally is producing YouTube videos about sports. He's talking about what he loves. He's creating things and writing and doing things that he really enjoys. And it's just a great example of someone who has built up career capital in media, in sports, and he is just cashing that in now to have a great job that I think a lot of you will enjoy. In our show notes, you'll find a couple links. First of all, Matt does a lot of these different videos. We talk about those, so you'll find links to those specific videos in the show notes. We talk about a couple different books, and in particular, there's a book he talks about called The Thing They Carried. It was one of the most influential books he read in influencing his career as a writer. And I want to thank our sponsors, Audible.com. They're giving a free trial to Beyond the Uniform listeners at beyondtheuniform.io/books. You can click there and you can actually get for free The Thing They Carried on audiobook, so you can listen to it while you go. A portion, when you do that free trial, we do at Beyond the Uniform get a little bit of money to help support the show, so that's very much appreciated. One other thing I really like about this episode is Matt talks about how he's in this media space where, I mean, just think about that. His title is around YouTube. He's doing something that this job did not exist 3 or 4 years ago. When he first started, Twitter wasn't even around. And so I think it's just a great example of how the workspace is changing, how there are jobs that you wouldn't even think of are available and out there. And I think Matt's a great role model of someone who has paved his own way. So with that, let's dive in to my interview with Matt. Well, joining me today in New York is Matt Ufford. Matt, welcome to Beyond the Uniform.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So for listeners, I wanted to give you a quick background on Matt. He is the editor-at-large and video host at SB Nation, a digital sports media brand and network of team sites built by and for the modern sports fan. He started out at Northwestern University, after which he served in the Marine Corps for 4 years as a tank officer. After the Marines, he worked as a columnist at AOL Sports, as well as an editor at Uproxx Media, where he founded their sports and TV blogs. So Matt, I always like to start off by asking what led you to leave the military, and how did you approach that decision?
Oh, man. So I grew up in the military, too. So my dad was an Air Force pilot for 22 years. He flew C-141s, big old cargo planes. And growing up in the military, I always had kind of an idea that I didn't want to make it a career for myself, and kind of ended up in the Marine Corps largely by accident, for at least in terms of my bigger life plan. And so I always knew that I wasn't going to be a lifer, but there was a time about 3 years and 9 months, 3 years and 8 months into my contract, where I thought that I was going to ship out to Iraq a second time, and come back and serve like a B billet stateside. And things just didn't really shake out my way. I was basically looking at getting the most likely scenario was if I came back from Iraq, if I was lucky enough to do that a second time, then I was probably looking at a really lousy B billet in the sticks somewhere, and I was very much wanting a B billet in a city, preferably on a coast, because when you're stationed in 29 Palms, California, the only thing you want to experience is civilization again. So with my instead of shipping out with the scout platoon for a second tour in Iraq, I basically said, well, I knew that I wasn't going to make this career anyway, so instead of doing the 7 years that I was expecting to do, I'm going to do 4, and let's let's go ahead and set this plan into motion now. So it was a little bit of I think kind of a knee-jerk thing, but ultimately the right one for me. I'm glad that once you make the military has kind of that siren's call where it is so satisfying, at least from a leadership perspective, and then you kind of have this the burden of guilt, of like leadership guilt, where like I can't leave behind my Marines. I'm letting them down if I'm not serving with them, and then you stay another 3 years and another 3, and then it's like, well, I'm 10 years in, I've already done this, I'm not going to leave now, and it's a lot easier to stay in, and I'm glad that as soon as I had the inkling that like this isn't the way I'm going to do my entire life, that once the decision is partway made, just leaping into it with my entire being.
Yeah, there's so much inertia to overcome too, and so many incentives to stick around. And so I agree. Like once you know you want to make that move, it's almost like pulling off the Band-Aid all at once and
Absolutely.
just making it.
Yeah.
I want to learn about your initial job search and kind of your road to where you're at right now. But let's actually just jump ahead. If you were talking to someone on active duty, how would you explain what you do right now for a living?
I would start with the easiest description and say that I make YouTube videos about sports. And if I got the old north-south on yes, I know YouTube, then I'd start saying, well, I'm also a writer for SB Nation. And if I have to describe SB Nation as, well, it's a bunch of team sports blogs, and there's also a central site, sbnation.com, that covers sports from a more fan-centric position, because we don't have TV rights. We're not a broadcaster, so it's a more of a loose media environment. And so if I have to explain SB Nation, then I stop there. But then if I dive into it, I do some feature writing, and I make some video features and video essays. So, but yeah, that's how I describe it.
So I'm just going out on a limb. I'm betting that 90% of veterans listening are wondering how they can do exactly what you've done, because I imagine that sounds like their dream job. What is take them through, what does your day-to-day life look like? Like, what does it mean to be doing that on a daily basis?
Oh man, it is an absolute lark. My job now is so delightfly meaningless and inconsequential that the only way that I can look at sports and covering sports is that it's the silliest, most fun thing. That's kind of what I like about this job, is that it allows me to, after the seriousness, the ultimate seriousness of combat in the Marine Corps. It gives you a perspective that somebody's just absolutely taking the New York Yankees' first regular season game and it's a loss and what a bummer, or the Super Bowl, the Falcons blowing a lead in the Super Bowl and they're just devastated by it, and it helps to just be like it is absolutely hilarious that this is people's entire lives. And it's not like I'm not dragging everybody down being like, oh guys, there's actually wars going on, we shouldn't care so much about sports. But what it does is that perspective helps me to laugh at anything, no matter how seemingly serious it is. It's while people, I can take I understand that people take things seriously, but for me, it allows me to kind of keep that dark humor that anybody who's served in the military, and I take that same kind of dark humor to sports, and it's a lot of fun.
That's awesome. And I'll put some links in the show notes for listeners to be able to watch some of Matt's videos. But I'm wondering, what does it take to bring one of these videos to life? Are you working with a team? Like, how long does it take to develop each video?
It's a lot harder than just writing. I moved to New York City with the intent on being like, I'm going to be a writer, capital W. I thought I was going to be very fanciful, and what I turned into was one of the very first people who had a full-time job sports blogging. Just cranking out quick little news stories 8 times a day. And then I kind of grew into writing, longer columns and articles. But I was used to, when you write an article, you're in control of everything, right? You control the message, and maybe you get some help from an editor, but largely it's 100% you. And then writing a script for video is very different, because I've got to consult with the director. How is this going to look? I've got to talk to the editor and be like, I was thinking visually, these pictures should be in it as well. And I've got to coordinate, studio time with producer, and I'm not even doing justice to actually how the process goes. But needless to say, it is a much more it's a team-oriented thing. And as the creative person, ultimately responsible for the video, when people watch my videos and hate my videos, they don't they don't send an email, or they don't respond on Twitter to everybody who made the video. It's just me, because it's my face that's in it. So it's all the you have all the responsibility, but the work is spread. The creative lifting is spread among a team of people, and that was definitely hard to get used to, but now that I'm used to it, I definitely like it a lot.
I just imagine being the front man. You get all the praise, and you get all the criticism. You get all the internet trolls who just kind of pile on with just stupid criticisms. That must be an exercise in developing a thick skin.
Yeah, and a lot of, you can edit an article. You can post an update to it and be like, and edit and change a word, and there's a typo. Once you publish something on YouTube, your choice is delete the entire video and all the views and comments that it might have up to that point, and then make the change and then re-upload it. There's the amount of effort that needs to go into vetting it is a lot greater than any sort of written piece.
In a given day, how much time do you spend writing for a text post versus writing or contributing towards a video?
For the most part, I'm focused on making videos, and depending on what the video series is, last week I wrote and shot 2 videos, both of which are still in post-production, and my main task today has been to go through the script and kind of drop in liner notes for what I envision as appearing on screen while I'm doing the little voiceover piece. And that's kind of heavy lifting, in terms of I'm using the strongest metaphor possible, because it's the lightest work imaginable compared to anything in the military. But it is, it's kind of taxing to go through. You've written this thing, you've shot it, and I want to just dust my hands off and be like, all right, done with that. Let's see the finished project. But I've got to go back into the script and be like, this is what this should look like. This is what this should look like. This is what I'm thinking about for this. And that's the entirety of my duties today. If I have some white space on my schedule, I might just write a little 500-page or 500-word blog post on whatever I feel like, because that's one of the nice things about having done, having been part of sports media online for the last 12 years is I'm kind of established at SB Nation. I've got some freedom to write about what I want. Making videos, I've got to go through a little bit more of a process, but if I want to write a blog post, that's on me to, do what makes me happy.
That's great. I had recently on the show an author, Cal Newport. He wrote this book that's called So Good They Can't Ignore You. And one of the premises of his book is that as people develop career capital, as they really get good at a particular skill set, they over time get a lot more autonomy. And what I love about what you were just saying is that you have, and we'll get into your career path, but you have really built up a very unique, very marketable skill set. And it's cool to hear that that's translated to you having a little bit more creative license at your current role, because you've got a lot of expertise in the world of sports and writing and video production. And I imagine that's pretty fulfilling to be at that spot now in your career where you're able to kind of cash in some of that capital to have what many would consider a dream job.
You're absolutely right. And there isn't a day that goes by that I stop and marvel at me being here, because, I moved to New York City, and I knew two people in the city of 8 million people, and I had no connections, and nothing that I'd done in the Marine Corps was useful for what I was trying to do. And to be here where, if there was a time when I took this job at SB Nation, where I was like, oh, I might fall flat on my face doing video. And I thought, like, well, that's fine, because if it doesn't work out, I can go back to like my capital, as you noted. I was like, I can go back to writing about sports online, like without missing a day at work. Someone will take me. And that confidence that happened over the course of 5, 6, 7 years was something that is still kind of mind-boggling. There should be more people who are better at it than I am.
No, I love that. I mean, I love that story of boldness and kind of willingness to take risk. And I just know a lot of the veterans I interview, there is that trepidation, especially when someone first leaves the military, that kind of navigating this unknown world. And it's always surprising to me the juxtaposition of the raw courage and boldness that all of these veterans employ, and then a little bit of the timidity they have when they do enter into a near career, and it's completely understandable. But I like that example from your own life of taking these risks, taking these calculated risks, and giving yourself the room to fail when you try something new. I think that's really admirable.
Well, thank you.
I'm thinking right now of maybe a listener who's on active duty, who's just listening to you, and your passion for your job comes through. They're listening to you and saying, "Man, Matt has got my dream job. How do I go about getting that? How do I go about getting there?" So I'd love to dive into whatever you'd like to share about your journey from the Marine Corps till now, or also just generic advice about how one might go about obtaining a job like the one you have.
Well, I'll share a little bit of my history. I'm almost disappointed that my history is going to be hard to apply to anyone else, because the media landscape, the internet landscape, has changed so much in the last decade. When I first started writing online, social media was not a thing. Like, Facebook was around, but it wasn't the behemoth that it was today. Like, I was writing on good old blogspot.com, and people navigated around, clicking around on, a blog roll on the left, and, Twitter didn't come until a couple years later. And so, for me to say, like, here's how I did it, and it's almost a poor lesson for anybody else. So, but the short version is, I had always loved writing. I'd done the high school newspaper, was the editor of that. But when I went to college, I didn't pursue journalism. I just stuck with history and political science, because those were a better path for a largely undecided college student, and I was a big-time history geek too. And so when I went into the Marine Corps, I thought maybe my path down the line will be history professor or some such. And it wasn't until I had a roommate in the Marine Corps who was another young lieutenant like I was, who had gone to a small private school in Michigan, and where he'd been a comparative lit major, named Jeremy Chesla. And he got me, I basically read all of the fiction that he threw at me, and he encouraged me to write. And I found out that 2 years after I graduated college, I was like, oh, writing is this thing that I love. That's what I want to do with my life. And so when I got out and moved to New York City, because that's where you go when you want to be a writer, that was largely the extent of my plan. I also had this idea of I've been connected to some former military guys who was kind of like a white collar building property management firm in Manhattan. I was like, oh, I'm going to get hooked up with a steady day-to-day job, and then I can write in my free time. And I don't know what happened. I messed up the second interview so badly that the guys never even returned an email after that. I still have, to this day, have no idea what I did wrong. And so instead of moving to Manhattan with a job that would have put me on my feet, I was largely unemployed or underemployed for the first 2 years that I lived in New York City. And so and that was a valuable experience, even though times were lean, in that it kind of made me seek out the lower rung jobs. I worked for a TV advertising company that got bought up by Nielsen. At one point, I was watching television and writing survey questions about product placement ads. And that's what I was doing at night. And then during the days, I was like a business development assistant for a little boutique firm, basically just filling out Microsoft Excel sheets and copying and pasting emails. And both the jobs were terrible jobs. They didn't pay enough. The people that I worked with the exception of a couple, were not inspiring leaders. And I was like, what am I doing? And I was just about ready to throw in the towel and give up on writing as a career. I picked up a GMAT book to study, and I was like, I'm going to go to business school. At least I'll make some money. And then I started a blog with a guy named Drew McGarry, who's now a big writer at GQ and a columnist for Deadspin.com. And we started an NFL, for lack of a better word, dick joke blog called Kissing Susie Colbert. And that took off immediately, and within the next 3 months, I was working full-time as a sports blogger. So that was all. That's the very much longer summation than I thought it was going to be. I was like, the short version cut to 5 minutes later, and I'm like, oh, by the way, then this happened.
No, this is great. What led you to, so when you started your own blog then with this friend of yours, was this just kind of like a late night drinking idea? Was this an ambition to do your own thing, or what kind of led you to start that?
I had started just a personal blog for a brief time during the World Cup, I want to say, of 2006. Yes, summer 2006. And it was by design, short-lived. It had a start and end point that were clearly defined. And it got more traction than I expected. And then I was like, hey, what should I do with this now? And Drew, who I was kind of like internet friends with at a time when knowing somebody only online was still a very weird thing. He was like, hey, why don't we start like a NFL humor blog? It doesn't seem like there are any good ones. And we did. And it led to online writing careers for both us and a couple other people too. So I parlayed that into one of the first blogging gigs for a lot of today's digital sports writers at AOL Fan House, now defunct. Everything that I ever wrote there is dust in the wind. And then I parlayed that gig at AOL Fan House to what is now the sports blog at Uproxx.com. So I basically just I got my foot in the door, got a little bit of recognition, and then I just the guy at Uproxx was like, I was kind of thinking about starting a sports blog. It might even be full time. And I was like, my head whipped around, and I was like, full time. And the next thing I did was I had several thousand words of a pitch. It just came out of me, and I was like, here's what I see. Here's what I see the market as. And all these things that I had implicitly thought or known just kind of came stumbling out of me as soon as there was I had the glimpse of an opportunity. And so it's everybody who talks about employment, their own employment at some point, talks about a mixture of luck and perseverance, and that for me was that moment.
I mean, what stands out with me with your story, or to me with your story, is you were willing to roll up your sleeves, and you had those 2 years of underemployment, and then you took these positions that I think a lot of people would view as more entry-level positions, and you rolled up your sleeves, and it sounds like you really did the grunt work in these starting positions and were willing to work your way up. And I love that phrase, the harder I work, the luckier I am. It seems like you were, when opportunity presented to you, you were able to take that risk. You were able to throw out something. You were able to start your own blog. You were able to throw out a summary of why you would want to work full time on this sort of sports blog. So I just love that story, that it seems like you're constantly hustling and constantly showing up, and as the opportunities present themselves, you're willing to take the risk and actually take a little bit of show a little bit of vulnerability in putting yourself out there.
Yeah, and if we're going to translate this skill set into someone who might be applying for a media job today, if you don't have experience or clips or any of that, a lot of the entry-level jobs are, especially in sports, are nights and weekends when the games are actually happening. The full-timers work their 9-to-5 shift during the day, and you, the young person, are there to cover what's happening on the weekends, the nights when the people with health insurance don't want to be working. And it can be a grind, but for a lot of our youngest and brightest people at SB Nation, will start out on that kind of the social media thing. And if you just focus on like the tweets, the Facebook updates, that's fine, you'll get by. But the ones who really shine are the ones who go above and beyond and do something that really creates value beyond what's in their job description. And that's the same across any industry. If you do more than is asked of you, people will notice, and you get funneled into having more asked of you. And the more you keep overproducing, the more comfortable you get as you get better and better jobs and more freedom to do what you want to do, because you have that history of making hits.
I love that. I mean, I love that thought of always going one step beyond, like over-delivering, being creative, and I could see how that would allow you to get more attention and be able to climb up the ranks faster.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, is there any resource? So again, if a veteran listening is interested in media or sports or any aspect of this type of career, are there any resources that you found helpful that you would recommend? That could be books or podcasts or websites or programs, just anything that helped you start to develop these skills or get fired up about this path.
Yes, I would say, but and this is a big time cop out, but it's for me it was the book that made me want to write. Or that kind of sent me along the path and just kind of blew my mind was The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. And that's not, useful in getting a job, but it was what inspired me to be a writer. And what that needs to be for everybody else is, especially if you're looking to start writing, is you're going to gravitate to people whose voice you like. Whether it's, if you want to do long-form, in-depth reporting, then you're going to have a favorite journalist in The New Yorker, right? If you want to write science fiction, then you're going to be reading all the science fiction. If you want to write fantasy, then you're going to read George R.R. Martin and Game of Thrones and that entire family. And so for me now, it started with The Things They Carried because I wanted to be a war memoirist, and then as it came away, then I kind of ended up in sports blogging, right? And I was like, well, I'm still going to be that war memoirist. That's the goal for it. And then as that job became a career, now I read the sports writers that I aspire towards. And for me, that's a lot of my colleagues. I'm surrounded by some very, very talented people. But so for anyone who aspires to write about sports or anything, find the people who you want to, who you aspire to write like, and then try to write like them. Your voice will eventually come out naturally. It will start out as a mimic, and then as you write more, you'll grow into your own voice. And the only way to do it, there's that whole Malcolm Gladwell thing of like 10,000 hours. And I don't know if I actually subscribe to anything that Malcolm Gladwell puts forth in that regard. But what I do know is the only way to get better is reps. Just keep writing, and whether it's on medium.com, whether it's your own personal Twitter feed, as a writer, you don't need like a bullet point list of accomplishments. I'm not impressed by a resume. I'm impressed by your most recent clips. So write is the only recommendation I have for anyone who wants to write, is just do it.
I find that so refreshing, Matt. I just appreciate your story, because I think that story of just resilience and I don't know if you ever read Stephen King's On Writing, but he's just got this great visual.
That's a fantastic book.
It's such a great book, and he talks about, in his apartment, this 1.5-inch thick nail, and he just put up every rejection letter he got. And by the time he was published for his first magazine, that 1.5-inch thick nail was just plastered with rejection letters, like hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of rejections. And I just love, and he also talks about how he writes, it's like every day he writes for like 6 hours, or it's like 6 pages or whatever it is, but every single day without fail, he sits down and writes, because just like you said, it's all about the reps. And I think that's hopefully a message that's encouraging for the veteran listeners, because I think that most veterans have that determination and that ability, and it's just applying what they've done in the weight room, out in the field, that thought of repetition. It's the same thing for what they want to do in their civilian career.
Yeah, we're gonna fall into a bunch of writing cliches, but people will always say like, oh, should I become a writer? And the first piece of advice is no, because it's a miserable job and it doesn't pay very well. And I don't mean it's miserable, but like because being a writer is a ton of fun. It's even as what I do is work on video, I still see myself as a writer first. But like the work itself, the act of writing, like, is miserable. It's like pulling teeth every single day. And the only thing that makes it worthwhile is getting that finished piece out of you and sending it out into the world and being done with it. And in the end, and maybe that's how this ties into military experience, and that like the actual grunt work is often miserable, but then you look back on it and you're like, oh, that was a good job. But people ask like, oh, should I become a writer? And like, you become a writer because it's the only thing that you want to do. And if you give it a try, if it's too hard or you don't really like, well, a lot of writers don't really like writing, but like if there's something else that you can do or feel like doing, then do that, because that thing, whatever it is that is not writing, probably pays better and is less of a headache and easier to find a job. So you should turn to writing when your brain is off by a couple settings and nothing else is remotely appealing to you.
This is great. Well, I know we only have a few minutes left, and so I always like to keep the last question open-ended and just ask you, knowing that you have an audience of active duty and recently transitioned veterans, any final words of wisdom or anything else you'd like to leave with them?
Oh, well, I've got a couple extra minutes. I think we're good for like another, like if you want to play around another 10 to 15.
Yeah.
But since you asked, my recommendation to anybody, and I think it ties back into what I said earlier. Like if you think that you want to like get out eventually, if you don't have, I really do believe in pulling that Band-Aid off. Where like, hey, this isn't where this isn't what I want to be doing with my life. Then do something else. Don't kill 3 years of your life at a duty station or a post that isn't fulfilling to you when you know there's something else you want to be doing. And I know a lot of officers who've gone to B-billets and have done, their master's degree part-time at night. And I just look at if I'd stayed in the Marine Corps an extra 3 years and, tried to transition into a more normal civilian life and made those connections, yeah, that would have been fine. But like, as it is, I talked about how I was underemployed or unemployed for 2 years before I was working full time. Well, that was 2 years. I saved myself at least a year by diving in and getting that out of the way. And the sooner you can start the rest of your life, the better off you're going to be. That isn't to say there aren't hardships, but for me, I don't know, what percentage of your listeners are, living safe every day of their lives, or who has extensive combat experience. But I lost a couple of very, very close friends in combat in the early days of the Iraq War, and I, at least every week, if not more frequently than that, I think about how those guys are underground. They're skeletons, and their lives stopped at 24, 25, 26. And I've had an extra decade in which I've gotten married, I've had kids, and like, if you're not treating every day like a blessing, then you're missing out, because this is like your chance to like every day out of the military when you're safe. Like you should be living life carefree and enjoying it.
That's so powerful. I mean, I love the perspective, even when we first started the conversation, of just saying like, look, what you do, you kind of bring this levity to it, where, even if it seems like the world is collapsing in the world that you work in, you realize the perspective of how safe and stable things are for you overall. And I love the gratitude as well of just recognizing how lucky we are to be alive and to have the opportunities that a lot of the people who served with us, they gave their life in service to their country, and they don't have those experiences that we're able to have on a daily basis. And so I just love that perspective. I think it's very powerful.
Yeah, and also like veterans entering the civilian workforce is incredibly beneficial for both veterans and civilians alike. In the landscape that we have today, there are so many people who've never even met someone who've served, and it's almost to the extent where it's the veterans are one of the smallest minorities in the United States now, and it's crazy to me that this was something that it's a defining feature of who I am. It's the most important years of my life in a lot of ways, and it might as well have happened on Mars. When I talk to some people who've just that's how distant it is for them, and it's important for those people to know that hey, when you work with a veteran, it's not this like, oh, dangerous, unhinged person. It's just like, it's someone who is, usually more competent than someone who doesn't have that experience, and is for lack of a better word, normal. And there's real value in that, and you should have that attitude going into the workplace. Not that your service makes you better than anybody who didn't serve, but just that you have a valuable background and viewpoint to give to prospective employers.
I think one thing that sticks out with me about that is so many of the guests I've had on the show talk about the dilemma that they faced in leaving the military. And you touched on this at the beginning as well, this thought of leaving people who are still serving, and this thought of like obligation to remain in service. And what I like about what you said is it's shining a light on the service that veterans serve in doing well in a civilian sector, where they are that representative. And I feel the same way. Almost everyone I've worked with or know as a friend outside the military, I'm one of the only
close friends they have that served in the military. And it's like being that example of someone who has achieved and someone who's doing well, someone who's likable and normal. And they don't, a lot of these people don't have a lot to draw on for veterans. They don't know what that is or what someone who serves in the military is. And so just recognizing the benefit that veterans are when they are on the civilian side as an example of just a normal person who has a lot to offer. I love that.
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, like, I feel it's lonely in my company. We have something like 800 employees now at Uproxx Media, which is our SB Nation's parent company. And I know of like 2 other people with military service, a guy who covers MMA and was a Marine artilleryman, and an Army reservist who covers baseball. And I'm like, I really feel like there should be more of us here, guys. So, you know, I certainly don't. I don't really have hiring powers in my company, but I'm always, you know, in one of the nice things about having a little bit of a public platform is that, you know, every now and then I can be like, hey, by the way, this is something I did. Like, here is the anniversary of the day, you know, our tanks entered Iraq. This is the Marine Corps birthday, November 10th every year. I'm like, by the way, forget Veterans Day. I don't care about Veterans Day. I care about the Marine Corps birthday the day before. And like I'm like the loudest Marine possible just that one day a year. I don't want to bother. I don't want to ram it down people's throats. But you know, like, I'm loud and proud on you know, whether it's July 4th or you know, important days to me on the calendar that stick out. Or there are situations too, and I know I haven't talked a whole lot about sports since I've come on, but like one of the videos that I did that was best received last year was in response to Colin Kaepernick taking a knee for the national anthem before 4 games. And as someone who served and would, you know, only ever stood at attention and still does stand at attention for the national anthem, like, that's not something that I would ever do. But as someone who's also sworn to uphold the Constitution of the United States, I also recognize what he's doing as a First Amendment right, and that's got to be the priority. And so it was a whole like 5-6 minute thing, like talking about like trying to have a nuanced conversation that acknowledges both sides of the discussion, and also, you know, one of those things is that, like, as a veteran, I have like the right to speak on that, and or people perceive me as being a trusted voice in that matter, and it kind of gives you a little bit of armor talking about something like that. You know, I'm not just somebody from the liberal media with an agenda. You know, I've got it's a personal take, and it gives you. And people respect your viewpoint when it comes to things like that. And it's valuable to have people who have military service because of those reasons. It makes it a more diverse workplace if you bring your background with you.
That's great. And for listeners, in the show notes, I'll put a link to the Colin Kaepernick video that Matt talked about, as well as a couple other ones from YouTube. But that's, you know, I love that too, and I love the balance that you have on that, where it is, you know, using the platform you have to have messages like that, and then, like you said, not ramming it down people's throat either, but just trying to keep that balanced perspective and adding your voice to the messages out there.
Yeah, I would love to, a lot of times, like, I'll feel. In the world of sports media, at least, it's like I feel a lot of times it's like me and a previous guest that you had on the show, the long snapper for Longhorns and Seahawks. His name's Nate
Boyer. Yep.
Yeah, Nate Boyer, and it's just like you know, Nate Boyer was you know, kind of like the go-to quote for a long time, because he's like, well, he's the guy who was sports and military, and there should be more people than me. There should be more people than Nate, and there's certainly room for others to enter the fray as well.
This is awesome. Well, Matt, I appreciate your time. I appreciate your example, and yeah, thank you for taking the time to speak to our listeners today.
Yeah, thanks. And, you know, anyone who happens to hear this, send me an email, mattufford@gmail.com. Hit me up on Twitter, @mattufford. Anything that I can do to help anyone who's considering a career in media or anything at all. I'd love to help you out if I can.
Surface, surface, surface.
Thanks for listening. 3 important notes before you go. First, Audible.com is offering a free audiobook for Beyond the Uniform listeners. I love Audible. I get 3 books a month, and it's a great way to use net, or no extra time, to polish off books while you run, drive, etc. If you go to beyondtheuniform.io/books, you'll not only find this offer, but you'll also find a list of every single book that has been recommended on this show. One in particular I'd recommend is The Hard Thing About Hard Things. This is a great story of determination and also a glimpse at what startups are really like. That's at beyondtheuniform.io/books. Second, there are so many great resources out there for veterans, it can be difficult to know all about them. That's why at beyondtheuniform.io/directory, you'll find a list of every single resource that's been mentioned on the show or that I've been able to find. You can also add your own if you find one I've missed. Lastly, I've put together several different free ebooks that provide data for veterans about their civilian career possibilities. This quantitative information serves as a great complement to the qualitative interviews I do each week. Go to beyondtheuniform.io, click on resources, and you'll be all set. Have a great week, and I'll be back next week with more interviews with military veterans about their civilian career.